This class isn't for janitor's kids. But what if the only person who could wake the dead turbine was exactly that? Winter in Cambridge doesn't fall in soft white like the postcards promise. It hangs gray like soot-dusted rooftops, gray like the tiled floors under hurried footsteps, gray like the morning sky that forgets to wake. It was 4:30 a.m. Most lecture halls at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology still slumbered in the dark, except for one hallway in Building B3, where a dull fluorescent light flickered outside the thermodynamics lab. That was where she worked, and where her daughter waited. The broom moved in slow, quiet strokes. The woman bent low, shoulders tucked under an old denim jacket patched in more places than it had original cloth. One yellow star stitched on the shoulder stood out, carefully sewn on by her daughter, using a hand-me-down needle from her grandmother. "We still shine, Mama," the girl had said when she finished, "even if we're small." A few steps away, behind the glass door of the lab, the girl sat curled up on a bench, arms wrapped around a thin notebook. She wasn't allowed inside the lab. Rules were rules, but from there, she could see the giant turbine. It sat dormant, like a metal beast locked in sleep. On her lap, a pencil. In her hands, a copybook. Not a textbook, but one her mother had written in by hand, long ago, when she cleaned labs in a small community college before the accident. "Entropy," she whispered, running her finger over the word like a prayer. "Disorder within a closed system. Heat only flows from hot to cold. Every system returns to balance, meaning no more motion." She'd sketched the turbine in soft graphite, each blade, each vent. Underneath, she wrote, "If everything is supposed to stop, how do you make it move again?" The broom paused. Her mother returned and gently touched her cheek. Cold. The girl hadn't moved. "I brought you something." The woman sat beside her, pulling a piece of bread wrapped in old newspaper from her coat. "Eat before the students come." The girl nodded, chewing quietly. But her eyes never left the turbine. "It feels sad," she said softly. "What does, baby?" "The turbine. I think it wants to work again." The woman smiled, tired but kind. The kind of smile forged from long years of silence, the kind that mothers give when they don't know what else to offer. She had once dreamed of finishing school. She had studied mechanical engineering at a community college before her husband died in a construction accident. After that, every dream was boxed away so she could clean floors and raise a child. Now, the only pieces left were the notebooks she had given her daughter, scribbled formulas and pencil diagrams passed down like heirlooms. "I want to take that class," the girl whispered, as if frightened by her own hope. Her mother hesitated. "You're not even in high school yet." "I don't want a seat. I just want to listen. Just to be there." There was no response, only a long look, then a gentle hand tucking a scarf around her shoulders. Her mother stood, broom in hand again, disappearing slowly down the hallway like a fading silhouette. Behind the glass, the turbine loomed, lifeless. The students in advanced thermodynamics had long given up on it. For weeks, the machine hadn't powered up. The main heating circuit failed. The bypass valve wouldn't open. The graphite shaft had signs of dry seizing. Some suggested dismantling it for diagnostics, but the lab lacked funding. It would take months. But the girl, sitting outside the door, kept watching, kept listening. More importantly, she could hear the turbine, not with her ears, but with something else, an intuition, a sensitivity, as though she could understand the language of the machine, its rusted sighs, its silent grief. A faint sound behind her. The door creaked open, someone passing through the corridor. The girl quickly lowered her head, pretending to write. The person walked by without noticing. But in that moment, she heard it again. A soft, strained whine, barely there. A whisper from inside the turbine's belly, like the breath of something long forgotten. Her mother returned, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's 6. Time to go." The girl rose, one last glance at the machine. This time she spoke, barely above a breath. "I'll come back, I promise." And that is where the story begins. Not with applause, not with recognition, but with a little girl, wrapped in a patched coat, listening to a sleeping turbine in a hallway no one noticed. A dream kindled not in bright lecture halls, but in silence. She came alone the next morning, still dark, still cold, still too early for students. But this time she didn't stop in the hallway. She stood outside room 317, Advanced Thermodynamics, according to the sign taped on the door. Beneath it, someone had scribbled in marker, "No auditing, no exceptions." She hesitated. The air smelled like old steel and hot dust. The smell of machines sleeping longer than they were meant to. Her breath fogged the glass. The girl raised one hand to knock, then lowered it, then raised it again. This time, the door opened before she touched it. A tall student walked out, holding a coffee too hot for the lid it wore. His eyes met hers for a second. She stepped aside without speaking. Inside, the lecture was already beginning. The professor's voice was clipped, direct, a scalpel of a voice. Not angry, not impatient, simply precise. Like a man who spent his life measuring time in microns. "Today," he was saying, "we address the heat capacity ratio and its impact on compressible flow in gas turbines." He turned to the whiteboard and wrote in wide, exact strokes, "Q is CP CV gamma, the ratio of specific heats, one of the constants we don't negotiate with." The girl slipped in, quiet as dusk, and found the last row, a broken chair near the wall. She didn't make a sound. No one noticed, or so she thought. A moment later, someone whispered just loud enough, "What's she doing here?" Another voice, sharper with a Boston edge. "This isn't the janitor's closet, kid." She tried not to react. Her hands found the edge of her notebook, gripping it as if it could hold her here. The professor paused, turned, scanned the room. His eyes landed on her like searchlights. "You," he said without raising his voice. The room fell silent. "I believe you are not enrolled." She stood up slowly. "No, sir. I just wanted to listen. I didn't mean—" "This class," he said evenly, "is not an observation deck. It's not a museum. It's not a shelter." He didn't shout. That would have been easier. His voice was even, flat, official. "Out." A few students laughed, not cruelly, but comfortably. The way people laugh when they feel safe, and someone else doesn't. The girl nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply turned, walked to the door, and left. The door closed behind her with a metallic click. Not loud, but it echoed in her chest for the rest of the day. She didn't tell her mother. That evening, as they walked home from campus along the frozen sidewalks of Memorial Drive, she said nothing about the class. She only talked about the river, how the ice cracked like distant thunder, how seagulls hovered over the Charles as if waiting for spring. Her mother didn't ask. She knew the silence. Sometimes silence is the only way a child tells the truth. The next day, she came back. Same coat, same notebook. She didn't go to the front of the room this time. She sat on the floor outside the lecture hall, where the corner of the glass wall gave her a partial view of the whiteboard. She couldn't hear everything, but she read lips well, and more importantly, She watched. She watched the professor solve equations like he was pulling thread through the fabric of the universe. She watched the students jot notes mechanically, few of them truly listening. Most were tired. Some were bored. A few were brilliant, but none seemed to love the subject the way she did. She wasn't supposed to be there, but she wasn't disturbing anyone. So no one said anything, except on Thursday. That was the day they brought the turbine back into discussion. The screen displayed a report in red letters. Turbine ID 4A, non-operational. Internal diagnostics failed. The professor sighed. "It's been a month," he said. "We've tried thermal cycling, valve replacements, sensor resets, nothing." One student, lean, sharp-eyed, raised a hand. "Professor, what if we bypass the main control board and isolate the secondary ignition line?" Another scoffed. "We'd burn out the starter coil." "Only if the shaft's still seized," someone else added. "She is," said the professor, almost wearily. "Dry graphite, no lube, no bypass airflow. We're dealing with entropy in full bloom, ladies and gentlemen." The girl tilted her head. Entropy. Not as a number, not as a formula, but as a state of being. Something that once moved, now refusing to. A kind of silence you couldn't measure in decibels. She opened her notebook. On a new page, she wrote, "Machines are like people. They don't die when they break. They die when no one tries to understand them." Later that night, she returned to the turbine room after her mother's shift. The lab was empty, the lights low, but she didn't need to go inside. She just needed to be near it. She sat on the floor again, cross-legged, listening, not with her ears, but with whatever part of her heart still believed that broken things could be brought back, not with power, but with patience. From inside the machine, there was no sound, but somehow, somewhere, she felt it waiting. The following Monday, something changed. The girl had come earlier than usual, before even the maintenance crew arrived. She sat in her usual spot, against the wall near the turbine room, notebook on her knees, a thermos of warm tea beside her that her mother had quietly filled before leaving for work. Outside, snow had finally fallen. Cambridge was quiet and white. Inside, the turbine was still sleeping. But something about the silence today felt different. She leaned in closer to the glass, forehead nearly touching the cold pane. The lab's main lights were off, but the emergency LEDs cast a faint blue over the turbine's body, outlining its curve like the silhouette of a sleeping animal. And then she heard it. Not loud, not sharp. A sound like breath caught in a throat. A soft hiss, fractured. A broken rhythm. She froze. The building was still. No footfalls. No HVAC. Only that sound, intermittent and faint, like pressure trying to escape, but trapped just beneath the skin of the machine. She put her ear to the glass. It came again. A whistle, then a pause, then another, sharper, like a sob behind a closed door. Her hands gripped the notebook. This wasn't mechanical noise. It wasn't the ambient creak of metal expanding or the groan of old ducts. She'd grown up in boiler rooms and janitor closets. She knew those sounds like lullabies. No. This was something trying to move. Trying and failing. She opened her notebook, turned past the sketches, past the formulas, until she found a page she'd left blank. Slowly, carefully, she drew the turbine again, but this time, instead of drawing its profile or blade arrangement, she mapped sound, waves, pulses. She timed the pauses, counted them. 12 seconds. Then a hiss. 7. then silence, then 15. Another hiss. Slightly higher pitch. The turbine was not dead. Not entirely. Something inside was trying to speak. Later that morning, during the lecture, she returned to her spot outside room 317. The class was going over turbine loss coefficients. The professor had drawn diagrams of pressure loss due to boundary layer detachment, flow separation near turbine blades, increasing entropy in the system. Each imperfection, he said, costs energy. The system bleeds efficiency the way a man bleeds heat in snow. You don't see it until it stops moving. He paused. Or until it starts screaming. The class chuckled politely. The girl didn't laugh. Her eyes were fixed on the diagram. The blade profile reminded her of something. Not just the shape, but the sound of air scraping past its edge. She had heard that sound this morning. And suddenly, everything made sense. What she'd heard wasn't just leaking pressure. It was flow disruption. Gas pushing into a clogged bypass line, unable to circulate back into the chamber. Which meant the turbine was still under internal tension. It hadn't fully vented after shutdown. And something inside, something mechanical, was still trying to cycle. Not much. Not enough to start. But enough to breathe. That night, she waited until the campus was nearly empty. She borrowed her mother's old ID card to unlock the outer lab door. The lab itself required biometric access. She couldn't enter, but she didn't need to. She sat just outside, right where she had before. But this time, she brought tools. Not to open anything. Not yet. Just a digital stethoscope. An old one. Cheap, probably tossed from a med student's kit. She'd found it in a giveaway bin and taught herself how to mod it with a contact mic. She pressed it against the lab's steel door, tuned the amplifier, sat completely still, and listened. There it was again. Not random, not noise, rhythm, flow attempt, pause, vent reflex. Then again. The turbine wasn't dead. It was stalled, which meant, in theory, she opened her notebook and began to write. This time, not thoughts, not sketches, but diagnostic steps. Check secondary airflow inlet for partial clog. Confirm bypass valve not fully sealed. Test blade shaft bearing for micro Cs at ambient pressure. Dry graphite coating likely degraded. Needs reapplication. Manual rotation at minimal torque might trigger resync. She circled the last line twice. Might trigger resync. Machines weren't people, but sometimes they behaved like them. Sometimes all they needed was a hand placed gently at the right place, a whisper that said, "You can try again." On Friday, the lecture took a different tone. The professor was clearly frustrated. The turbine had failed a remote boot attempt during a class demo, embarrassing the graduate team. Funding was now on review. A research assistant had suggested replacing the entire subsystem. "We don't have the budget for a new core," the professor snapped. "But if it's the graphite bearing," someone offered, "we'd need to tear down the housing, which would void every internal calibration." The girl outside the glass sat up straighter. The professor turned back to the board, muttering under his breath, "Damn machine's dead anyway." That was when she stood. She walked quietly into the room. Again. Gasps. The same students from last time. Same mocking eyes. But this time, she didn't go to the back. She walked to the front. The professor turned, eyes narrowing. "I told you," she interrupted gently, voice steady. "It's not dead. Not yet. It's breathing. You just can't hear it." The room went still. "What did you say?" "The turbine. It's not shut. It's cycling, barely. You've got a partial seal on the bypass. Pressure's fighting the vent line. If you give it minimal torque and reduce ambient friction, it might sink. A beat, then two. Then the room burst into laughter. She's serious. Did she just say ambient friction? What is this, a science fair? The professor didn't laugh. He stared at her, then turned slowly to the whiteboard. He erased one line, rewrote the airflow equation, paused. You said the bypass isn't fully sealed? She nodded. 12-second intervals, intermittent hiss. You're leaking airflow just above the main duct. How would you know that? I listened. The room had gone still. No one laughed anymore, not because they believed her, but because something in her voice had refused to tremble. She stood there, no taller than the lab table beside her, holding a notebook patched with tape, graphite dust smudged along the edges. She didn't blink. She didn't back down. And she didn't look away from the man in front of the board. The professor, a man who had lectured before Congress, advised NASA engineers, and turned away more graduate students than most would ever teach, now found himself facing her. He tapped the whiteboard with the butt of his marker. You say you listened to it? She nodded. At night, through the wall. He narrowed his eyes. You have access to the lab? No, she replied quietly. I sit outside. My mom cleans this floor. Whispers rippled again, the kind that curl like cold wind around the back of your neck. The janitor's kid, someone whispered. Of course. The professor took a step closer. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. But the air changed. The room leaned in. You claim that Turbine has a pressure leak above the main duct, that it's not dead, just stalled. Yes. You propose we manually torque the shaft, reseal the bypass, and apply friction reduction to the dry graphite lining, based on sound? She nodded once. He looked at the class. Some faces were amused, some confused. One or two, just a few, looked thoughtful. And then he turned back to her, caped in that silence professors wear when they're about to teach a lesson the hard way. Very well, he said. He walked over to the center of the room, crossed his arms. If you can fix that turbine before this class ends. He paused, as if deciding something internally. I will apologize, publicly. The silence cracked, not from noise, but from expectation. A few students snorted, assuming it was a trap, a stunt. Surely the professor was just calling her bluff to make a point, but she didn't smile, didn't flinch. Okay, she said softly, and walked to the lab door. The professor swiped his ID. The door opened with a hiss. She stepped inside. The lab was pristine, cold, and vast. The turbine sat at the far end like a dragon no one dared wake. Her footsteps echoed on the floor tiles. No lab coat, no gloves, just a child in second-hand boots, a pencil behind one ear, and an understanding that didn't come from textbooks. The class gathered behind the glass wall. The professor stood apart, arms still crossed, saying nothing. She walked around the machine first. Slow, respectful. Then knelt beside the base panel. With fingers bare, she pressed against the housing just below the bypass valve, her eyes closed, and she did nothing. For 5 long breaths. Behind the glass, a voice said, "What is she doing? Meditating?" Another voice laughed. "Waiting for spirits?" But the professor, he had gone very still, because he noticed something none of them did. She had placed her hand exactly over the panel they'd flagged in the 3rd inspection report, a section too minor to cause full shutdown, but odd enough to file away as an anomaly. She hadn't seen the report. He was certain of that. But she'd gone straight to it. By feel. She opened a small roll of cloth, her tools. Nothing special. Just a few wrenches, an oiler tin, and a graphite stick. Old. Her mother's, most likely. With swift fingers, she unscrewed the side latch, just enough to loosen pressure. The hiss returned, sharper now. She didn't jump. She listened. Then adjusted the bolt by 1/8 of a turn. Next, she dipped the graphite stick into the bypass slot. Not to fix, just to coat. Just enough to give it breath. And finally, she reached under the shaft and felt the torque collar. Everyone watched. Even those who had mocked her now leaned in, as if their bodies were trying to catch up with their doubt. She braced her arms and pushed. Not hard. Just once. A gentle, circular motion, like helping a wheel remember it was born to turn. The turbine clicked. Not loudly. But those who had ever worked with machines recognized the sound. Not power, not ignition. Engagement. A faint green LED blinked on near the main panel. One, then off, then again. She stepped back, turned to the professor. "It's ready." "You haven't even run a diagnostic," someone scoffed. But the professor had already walked into the room. He didn't speak. He moved toward the control station. Slowly, as if not to frighten something wild. He looked at the log. Cycle pressure, nominal. Bypass vent, stable. RPM, static, but responsive. He looked once more at her. She stood by the exit, not smiling, not expectant. Just quiet, like she had already said all she needed to say. He pressed start. Nothing at first. Then a cough, a hiccup of metal and breath, then the soft rising of whirring blades like something clearing its throat after a long sleep. Then, a roar. Not violent, not chaotic, but alive. The turbine spun, clean and strong. The green LEDs lit up one by one, cascading across the interface like a string of fireflies answering roll call. Outside the glass, the class erupted. Some clapped. Some gasped. One dropped his pen. But inside, the girl simply watched the machine and whispered, "Hello again." When the turbine roared back to life, it was not the noise that stunned the room. It was the silence that followed. The kind of silence that doesn't happen in labs or lecture halls. The kind that belongs in churches or train stations when the last train leaves. The kind of silence that only follows the impossible. She didn't smile. She didn't turn to the glass where the student stood. She just stepped back from the machine, one step, then two, and stood near the lab wall, her hands folded like she'd finished sweeping a floor. But now, it was them who didn't know where to stand. Outside the lab, behind the thick pane of safety glass, the class stared. Some students blinked, as if waking up from a lecture that had gone on too long. One boy looked down at his notebook. He hadn't written a single word since she walked in. Another, a girl with bright pink headphones around her neck, whispered, "She actually did it." But most didn't speak. They only stared. Their eyes carried too many things all at once. Confusion, pride, though no one admitted it, and something colder, disbelief struggling against the evidence of their own eyes. The professor didn't say anything at first. He checked the diagnostics again, scanned each blinking light, verified each RPM reading. And then he stepped away from the console. He turned toward her. "You said 12-second intervals?" She nodded. And you noticed pressure cycling through a door? I listened for 4 days. I counted. There was a pattern. He didn't speak again for a moment. And then he did something very few had ever seen him do. He stepped forward, looked her in the eyes, and extended his hand. "I was wrong," he said, publicly. There was no applause, no music, no perfect camera angle, just a girl, looking up at a man who had once told her, "Out," now offering her something more than a handshake, a place. She looked at his hand for a long time, then slowly raised hers. Their fingers met, and behind them, the turbine hummed on, steady and content, like an animal that had finally been heard. Later, outside the lab, the voices returned. This time not laughter, but whispers. "That was insane. Who is she? She's not even in the system. I heard her mom mops the chemistry building." The girl didn't speak. She just walked back to her corner by the hallway bench and picked up her thermos. It was still warm. She took a sip and waited. A minute passed, then 2. Footsteps. Someone was approaching. A tall student, thick glasses, old boots, and a backpack held together by safety pins, stood in front of her. He didn't smile, but he didn't mock her either. He held out a notepad. "You wrote down the intervals?" he asked. She nodded. "May I see them?" She opened her notebook, turned to the page. He studied it, carefully. "Your count matched our logs," he said, "to the second." Then he looked up. "I'm Luis, research assistant, grad student." She said nothing. Then, softly, "I'm just here to learn." He tilted his head. "So are we all." More footsteps. Another student approached, this one more hesitant. The girl with the pink headphones. "Hey," she said, almost a whisper. "Sorry I laughed earlier." The girl nodded, said nothing. "I thought you were just—" She stopped herself. "Just what?" the girl asked gently. The other girl blushed. "I don't know. I guess I wasn't listening either." But not all the eyes had changed. Farther down the hallway, by the vending machine, 2 students stood with arms crossed. One leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "She got lucky." "Seriously," said the other. "She touched it once and it spun. What, is she a machine whisperer?" They laughed, but quietly. Not for the room to hear, just for each other. Whispers made for small places. In the janitor's locker room that evening, her mother folded her uniform slowly. The girl sat nearby, legs swinging off a bench. "You didn't get in trouble, did you?" her mother asked, brushing hair from her daughter's eyes. "No," she said. "What happened?" The girl paused, then smiled, just a little. "Something started spinning again." The mother didn't ask more. She didn't need to. That night, in the quiet of their one-room apartment, the girl opened her notebook again. This time, she didn't sketch turbines or draw formulas. She turned to a clean page and wrote just 2 lines. "Some machines break. Some are never allowed to start." Then she drew a door, half open, and behind it, light. The next morning, the turbine room was open. She arrived before sunrise, as always. This time, she didn't sit outside the glass wall. She walked in through the front door, as if the space had always belonged to her. She wasn't wearing a badge, no ID card, no lab credentials. Only the quiet permission that comes when no one dares to say no anymore. The lab lights were still dim, humming with that soft, early morning electricity only machines recognize. The turbine stood waiting, cool now, resting after yesterday's awakening. She approached it slowly, placed her hand, again, on the housing. Not to fix anything, just to listen. At 8:00 a.m., the students began to arrive. One by one, they walked into the lab expecting equations, expecting critique. But instead, they found her already there, sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed, hand resting on the side panel like she was praying. No tools, no wires, no movement, just stillness. They whispered at first. Is she meditating? She's just sitting there? Maybe she's waiting for it to talk back. But no one laughed, not out loud, because the turbine had talked back yesterday, and no one else had heard it. The professor arrived last. He paused at the doorway and saw her, sitting in complete silence. No calculation, no command. Just communion. He didn't interrupt, didn't call the class to order. Instead, he sat down at the edge of the bench and watched. 5 minutes passed. No words were spoken. The only sound was the faint electric breath of the control panels and the distant hum of the city waking up outside. But something was happening in that silence, because in those 5 minutes, for the first time, the class began to understand. She wasn't just listening to the machine, she was reading it. The way a doctor reads a pulse, the way a musician hears the tension in a string before it breaks. She was, in some strange way, fluent in the language of failure. The professor leaned forward. Why 5 minutes? He asked quietly. She opened her eyes, met his gaze, and said, It takes 5 minutes for it to forget it was broken. The room went still again. He didn't laugh. He nodded, slowly. And suddenly, something cracked inside him. A memory of himself, decades ago, alone in a freezing hangar in Michigan, trying to restart a malfunctioning compressor. Everyone else had given up, but he sat beside it for hours, not fixing, just watching. Because somewhere inside that machine, he had seen a reflection of himself. Back then, no one listened to him either. He had forgotten that. Until now. He stood up, cleared his throat, and turned to the class. Today's lesson has already begun, he said. I suggest you pay attention. No one moved. He gestured toward the turbine. Let's review what actually happened yesterday. Someone diagnosed a 3-layer mechanical stall using auditory pattern mapping and a graphite-based bypass recovery, with no access, no code, no diagnostics. He looked at her. She didn't override the machine. She reminded it how to be what it was built to be. Luis, the grad student with taped-up boots, raised a hand. So, what do we call that? What kind of engineering is that? The professor thought for a long moment, then answered, Grace. Later that afternoon, he handed her a key, a small silver one, not digital, just metal. It opened the tool cabinet inside the lab. Use what you need, he said, then paused. You've earned it. That evening, her mother waited in the hallway again. She watched her daughter come down the steps, hands dusty with graphite, hair tied back with a pencil still stuck in the knot. You stayed late, her mother said, smiling gently. They gave me a key, the girl replied. The mother blinked. To the building? No, the girl whispered, holding it up. To something better. The lab was too quiet. Not because no one spoke, but because everyone was holding their breath. They stood behind the safety glass, pressed close, crowded like observers in a surgical theater. No one moved. No one shifted weight. Not even the professor. On the other side of the glass, the girl stood alone, in front of the turbine. She had 10 minutes. That was the window the system gave before it would auto-lock and shut down the test cycle. 10 minutes before the sensors would demand official clearance she didn't have. 10 minutes to do what a dozen engineers couldn't do in a month. She knew that. And still, she took her time. From the cloth roll her mother had sewn for her years ago, out of an old pillowcase, she unwrapped 3 things: a torque wrench, mismatched and taped at the grip, a small tin of dry graphite lubricant, labeled in faded Sharpie, and a screwdriver, short, dull, with the end worn soft from use. No digital calibrators, no real-time displays, no help, only hands and memory. She dropped to her knees beside the turbine's belly. The housing was warm, residual heat from yesterday's partial restart, but not hot, not yet. With quiet fingers, she found the first bolt, not the largest, but the one that controlled the angular seat of the bypass valve. It had been over-torqued by a full 6%. She didn't guess. She felt it, the way a violinist knows when a string is wound too tight. Click, a quarter turn, then a pause. She moved next to the base of the shaft. There, where the graphite lining had degraded, she dipped 2 fingers into the tin, rubbed them together until the black powder clung like dust to her fingerprints, and gently applied a coat in a slow, circular motion. Graphite wasn't oil. It didn't make things soft. It made things honest. Friction was never the enemy. Friction told you the truth. Minute 4. She turned her attention to the pressure relief valve. It had jammed on reset after shutdown, which caused the earlier misfire, something the system logs hadn't even caught. Using the old screwdriver, she pressed lightly into the housing plate, adjusted the spring tension until she heard it. Tch! 1 click. That was enough. No one taught her that. She had heard it before, in a vacuum cleaner motor that nearly exploded when she was 8. She remembered. She always remembered. Minute 6. Her shirt clung to her back now. The lights in the lab felt hotter. Still, she worked without rushing. She whispered to herself, not words, but counts. 3/4 torque, pause, 1 seal seat, soft latch, not hard. It was like a ritual, a prayer made of movements. The class behind the glass stood frozen. Luis, the grad student, leaned so close his glasses fogged. The girl with the pink headphones covered her mouth, her eyes wide. One student muttered, "This is impossible." The professor didn't answer. He was watching her hands. He wasn't thinking about turbine design anymore. He was remembering the first time he held a wrench at 15 in his uncle's barn, taking apart an irrigation pump to understand why it leaked when the sun was high. He had forgotten that moment for 30 years, until now. Minute 8. She stood up, back to the control panel. There was one final adjustment. She reached under the main housing and found the rotational collar of the shaft, the mechanical heart. Just once she turned it, not with force, with permission. The turbine shifted, a tremble, a breath, then stillness again. She walked to the side console, typed 3 commands into the manual interface. The screen lit up. Initiate, test, spin. Duration, 12 Secchi mode, inertia only. Her finger hovered over the green button, then pressed. The turbine did not start with a roar. It began with a hum, a low, beautiful hum, like a cello string drawn slowly in deep winter. Then, rotation. Slow at first, just enough for the blades to find their balance, then faster, clean, circular, not full power. But enough to prove it lived. No stutter, no stall. 12 seconds of motion. Then the system stopped itself as programmed. But it had been enough. It had remembered how to turn. Inside the observation window, a voice said, She just stabilized a mechanical heart. Another whispered, "She made it. Sing." And still, she didn't look up. She just exhaled, long and steady. 10 minutes. That's all it took. When she stepped out of the lab, the hallway was filled with silence again. Not awkward, but reverent. As she passed, one student stepped aside. Another said nothing, just nodded. Even the ones who once rolled their eyes now made room, quietly, without being told. The professor stood at the far end of the hallway, arms folded. He didn't speak, but when she passed him, he said only one word, "Tomorrow." She nodded and kept walking. That night, as her mother folded laundry in their small apartment, the girl sat at the table, sketching. But not turbines, people, the students, the professor, all with different eyes, all watching, all beginning to see. It happened on a Tuesday. No ceremony, no camera crew, no newspaper headlines, just the girl, the machine, and the moment. She had come early again, not because she had to, she never had to, but because the turbine was waiting like a question left unfinished. This time, the lab wasn't empty when she arrived. The professor was already there. Sitting alone on the steel bench near the back wall, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. He didn't greet her. He didn't need to. She walked in, laid her tools on the floor in silence, and sat in front of the machine as if she were opening a book she knew by heart. And in a way, she was. That day, she didn't touch the machine. She only looked at it. She listened. And when the clock struck 9, she stood and spoke, for the first time that morning. "Try now," she said. The professor hesitated. "You're sure?" She nodded. So he stood, walked to the control panel, entered the override sequence. His fingers hovered for a second over the command, then, "Initiate full spin-up." The room dimmed as the power diverted. A low-voltage hum crept into the floor. The overhead lights flickered, not out of fear but anticipation. The first sound was not dramatic. It was soft, like a breath. Then another, a hiss, a coil tightening, a blade shifting into memory. Then, the roar. It wasn't violent. It wasn't angry. It was alive. The turbine sang, truly sang. Blades caught rhythm. Airflow synchronized. Pressure levels balanced themselves in real time. The diagnostic screen pulsed green across all systems. RPM. Optimal thermal load. Stable vibration. Normal output. 96% nominal. The lab filled with sound. Not just noise, but resonance. A hum so clean it could have been mistaken for music. And in that moment, no one moved. The hallway outside began to fill. Students from other labs poked their heads in, drawn by the unmistakable sound of power waking up. Someone whispered, "Is that 4 Alpha?" Another answered, "She started it." She? You know, the girl. And just like that, the myth began to take shape. Inside, the professor stepped back from the console. He removed his glasses, closed his eyes, and listened. Not to the machine, but to what it meant. She, meanwhile, didn't look at the data, didn't touch the console. She sat, knees folded under her, eyes closed, hands on her lap. Just listening. Smiling. The kind of smile that comes not from pride, but from recognition. Like hearing an old friend laugh again after a long illness. Then, someone else entered the room. Slow steps, soft shoes. The girl didn't see her at first, but the professor did. He turned to the doorway and stepped aside. And there, in the silence beneath the turbine's roar, stood a woman in a faded work uniform, hair pulled back, hands wringing a cloth she no longer needed to hold. Her eyes shimmered. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only breath. The girl turned, saw her mother, and stood. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the girl walked across the lab floor, not fast, not shy, but with the calm of someone who had earned every step. She stopped in front of her mother and held out her hand. "I made it work," she said. Her mother looked past her to the turbine. It was glowing now, blades alive, monitors blinking in sync like a heartbeat rediscovered. The woman swallowed. "I heard it down the hall," she whispered. "I knew it was yours." And then the professor spoke, quiet, measured, but no longer cold. "She did something we couldn't." The mother turned. "I'm not surprised," she said. "She's been fixing things since before she could spell her name." The lab, once cold and clinical, now felt warm, not from heat, but from the quiet dignity of something restored. The machine, the mother, the child, and something else. Respect. Later that day, the girl was given a name badge, not a guest pass, not a visitor's sticker, a proper laminated ID. It read, "Access, Engineering Lab, B3, Level, Research Contributor, Name, Eleanor." It was the first time the class learned her name, and the first time they spoke it with care. That night, back in their apartment, Eleanor sat with her mother over a small bowl of soup. Outside, snow fell again. Her mother sipped quietly, then said, "You know, it sounded like music." Eleanor looked up. "The turbine?" Her mother nodded. "Like a morning song. Like something waking up." Eleanor smiled. It remembered how to sing. He stood at the front of the room, back straight, hands folded behind him. The same man who once said, "This is not a shelter, out," now faced a room that felt completely changed. Though it looked the same, the whiteboard. The turbine humming behind the glass, the rows of students in their usual chairs. But today, there was a presence in the air. Not tension, not pride, something deeper, reverence. Eleanor sat in the back row, not hiding, not waiting, just sitting, like someone who had nothing left to prove. Louise sat beside her. The girl with the pink headphones sat in front. Even the two boys who used to scoff now said nothing, their notebooks open, pens uncapped but unmoving. Everyone was waiting for the professor. He cleared his throat and looked straight at Eleanor. His voice, when it came, was steady, not loud but strong, like someone walking barefoot across a cold wooden floor. "I have taught at this institution for over 30 years, he began. "I have published more than 40 peer-reviewed papers. I've advised engineers who built components for the Mars lander. I've failed a dozen students who didn't read the footnotes." A few soft chuckles. But not from Eleanor. She simply watched him. No judgment, no challenge, only attention. "And still," he said, "I have never, not once, been more certain that I was wrong." He turned toward the board, wrote 3 words in all capital letters. "I was wrong." He underlined it once, then turned back around. "She is not a student of record. She has no clearance, no coursework, no credential. And yet, she did what we could not." He paused. "And more importantly, she did not ask for recognition. She asked to listen." He stepped down from the raised platform and walked toward the back of the room. Students parted to let him through. He stopped in front of her, and slowly, with no fanfare, offered his hand. "Eleanor," he said, "I owe you a public apology, and a personal one." She looked up at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no bitterness, only a quiet stillness. As if part of her had been waiting for this moment, not to be celebrated, but to see if someone like him was capable of this gesture. She stood. Her small hand met his. They shook once. Then he let go. For the first time, the class clapped. Not loudly, not like at a sports game, but slowly. Deeply, like applause for something sacred. Outside the room, through the hallway window, the snow had begun to melt. Eleanor walked to the turbine after class. Alone. She stood before it, pressed her hand to its side, the same place she'd always touched it. It purred. Not roared. Not sighed. Just purred. A machine that had been dismissed, now entrusted. That evening, the professor submitted a memo to the department head. He included system logs, diagnostics, video footage, and a handwritten letter. The subject line read, Unregistered Talent, Independent Engineering Contribution. Inside he wrote, Her name is Eleanor. She has no formal training, no access card, and yet she diagnosed a system we abandoned. She restored it. She did not guess. She observed. She respected. She listened. We did not teach her, but we would be wise to learn from her. Back in their apartment, her mother read the message aloud, word by word. Eleanor listened in silence. When she finished, her mother said nothing for a while. Then, Do you want to frame it? Eleanor shook her head. It's not the letter I want. Her mother looked up. What then? The next page, Eleanor said, and opened her notebook. She turned to a blank sheet, wrote only one sentence. Respect isn't given. It's revealed. Then drew a turbine, small, but turning. Spring came quietly to Cambridge. There was no fanfare, no parade, just the slow thaw of snow in the gutters, the hush of wind finding its way back through the trees. And in the basement of Building B3, the turbine still turned, not loudly, not constantly, but faithfully, like a guardian. Eleanor now had full access to the lab. Her badge worked at every door. She had a locker with her name on it, a chair no one sat in but her, and a desk, a real one, where her tools no longer needed to hide in cloth rolls. Her notebook had grown thick, filled with not just sketches and formulas but ideas, designs for smaller turbines, cheaper engines, alternative airflow systems made from recycled parts. Louise helped her test some. The professor reviewed every page. The girl with the pink headphones, whose name was Harper, stayed late after class now. Sometimes just to watch, sometimes to learn. One afternoon, Eleanor sat alone in the lab. The turbine was off, but warm. The silence was gentle. She placed her hand on the machine, as she had on that first day, and said softly, Thank you. Not for the glory, not for the story, but for having broken just enough to let her be the one to fix it. The professor walked in behind her. He carried a letter. You've been offered an early mentorship scholarship, he said. Full access, summer research, labs, mentorship, stipend. She looked at him. I'm honored, she said. He tilted his head. But, Eleanor closed her notebook. I need to go home for the summer. He blinked. You mean, back to your apartment? No, she said gently. Home, where I came from. The professor sat down, said nothing at first. Then finally, he asked, Why now? Eleanor smiled. There's a barn behind our trailer. My mother used to sweep it just so I could pretend it was a lab. She paused. There are kids there. Quiet ones, like me. One of them is already building windmills out of soda cans. He stared at her. I thought you were the Turbine Whisperer. She shook her head. I'm just the first one who got heard. A week later, Eleanor left Cambridge. No ceremony, no applause, just a box of books, a toolkit, and her mother by her side. They took the long bus back through dry farmland and cracked highways, through towns with one streetlight and a single gas station. And at the edge of it all, home. The barn still stood, crooked, dusty, but waiting. That summer, Eleanor taught 4 children, all under 12. She didn't teach them from textbooks. She taught them how to listen to broken things, how to tell when a screw was tight just by touch, how to hear when a machine wasn't angry, just tired, how to look at a blueprint and imagine something kinder. They called the barn the Quiet Lab. They built their own turbine. It lit up a single bulb, and for them, that was enough. At MIT, the professor kept her desk empty. No one took her seat. He placed a small plaque above it. Eleanor's Corner, for those who fix what others abandon. Years later, one of the children from that barn would apply to MIT. In the essay, he wrote, "A girl once taught me how to listen to broken machines. But what she really taught me was how to listen to people no one listens to." The turbine still turns, the barn still stands, and under every roof where someone listens, she is still there. Thank you for staying with this story, quietly, patiently. If a machine once thought dead can be brought back to life, maybe forgotten dreams can return too. Eleanor's story isn't the end. It's a small flame, enough to warm a heart that's gone cold from being unheard. If this story made you feel even a little seen, then stay. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this, quiet stories, but never ordinary. Thank you, truly.